as a law clerk, you think you know everything and that it's going to be so easy. And once you're there, then the judges will finally see the error of their ways and you're going to be able to always win. That clearly didn't happen. It was the roughest, probably 2 years of my life.
My guest today is attorney Joe Bugni, who I can't even begin to give an appropriate welcome to, because beyond the amazing achievements that you've had professionally, you are somebody that I consider a mentor and somebody that I met as a law student, I think in appellate writing and advocacy class. And you were a guest speaker and your presentation was so engaging that I think that definitely pushed me to want to intern for the Federal Public Defender's Office. And from there, over the years, not only to just me, but to so many other attorneys in Wisconsin and elsewhere, you have been an incredible resource. So welcome and thank you. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, thanks, Lexi, for that kind introduction and those words. I do remember that class. It was probably the highlight of teaching there, getting to know you and so many other students. So my name is Joe Bugni. I grew up in Bayview, pretty close to where you guys are filming, in beautiful Milwaukee. I went to public school there throughout my whole life. I then went off, played football in college, came back, discerned a vocation about whether or not I was going to be a priest. Discerned I was going to marry a beautiful woman who is now my wife, and went off to law school. After law school, I was very fortunate to clerk for a federal district judge down in Florida, where I clerked for 3 years, and then on the Court of Appeals for 2 years in Chicago, where we were based in South Bend, but it was the Seventh Circuit in Chicago. And then I worked at the Federal Defenders for about 13 years before I transitioned here to Hurley Burrage.
One of the things that you mentioned, and I want to talk about because I'm curious, what were the differences in terms of your clerking experience? Because you mentioned that you had clerked for a federal district judge and then also for an appellate judge on the Seventh Circuit. Tell us what that was like and what are some experiences that you think were different between those two?
Yeah, so it was night and day. I was really blessed. Both guys were great judges. Everybody says it about their judge, but I really, especially after practicing for a long time, I've come to respect more and more. And I appeared before Judge Mannion often, probably maybe 15 times in the Seventh Circuit. So I got to know him both as my boss and as a judge. Didn't always agree with his rulings, but he was still a fair judge. The district court is way better than the Court of Appeals. The district court it's wonderful. I was able to see about 45 trials in my time there, including some really long 7-week trials, or one was 7 weeks, one was a lot sort of shorter, but they got to see advocacy on so many different levels. And the judge was really big on mentorship. And so he had you sit in the courtroom during the trial, and he was very old school. So he'd always write out on Post-it notes and hand you a Post-it note about what was going well or what the person shouldn't be doing, or whatever it would be. And it was awesome. I learned so much watching the advocates and having my judge give me the insights into the rules of evidence or persuasion, advocacy. He was tremendous. And then during each break, we would gather together in the conference room and sit around and talk about what the advocates did well, what they didn't do well, what he would have done, what he thought was effective. It was the greatest experience of my career.
So in terms of your time with the district court, do you think that in particular, well, I guess both of them really, I mean, they're very different experiences in terms of what a court is looking for when we're talking about appellate issues versus trial court issues. And so I guess one of the questions that I have for you is, how did that shape your approach to representing clients, right? Because in a sense, there's like things that we think about on the trial court level. It's like, okay, I know that this issue could be an appellate issue. I need to make sure that I'm doing what I'm doing correctly so that that issue is preserved for down the road if it becomes an issue, versus trial advocacy, which is, it's related to that, but it's also very different, right? Because we're talking about how do we convince a judge or a jury that this is the appropriate outcome for our client, right?
Right. So how did it form me? I think, so in both ways, you just want to win. That was always drilled into me. Like, you need to win. you're far more likely to win on the trial court level. And, of course, as criminal defense attorneys, we always recalibrate what a win is. Sometimes it's a guilty plea and you're like, oh, it's 20 years.
Yeah,
and that sucks, but it's a win, because otherwise it could have been so much worse. On the trial court, what I saw was what you're really looking to do is make them afraid to lose. The government needs to be afraid to lose. So you're hitting them with different motions. You have so many different avenues of attack, whether it's going to be their star witness or their case agent or their motions to suppress or the jury instructions, or just, I'm going to beat you at trial with my cross-examination skills. So the whole field is open and you can win at any kind of battle, right? But the Court of Appeals, you really have 2 or 3 issues. Usually more than a 3-issue brief is very difficult to pull off. So everything is sort of like gathered to those 3 issues, and it's really hard to win those cases. As far as, I think that when you're on the trial court, what you're doing is setting yourself up for the Court of Appeals. So like, you want to test out your theories. It's not just that you're like, well, I'll figure that out when I get to the Court of Appeals. I'm always looking to think, okay, well, like, how is this a good legal issue? If it is, let me test it out. Like, let me keep on pushing this jury instruction, or let me keep on pushing this search warrant. And then on the Court of Appeals, what you're looking to do is, in my view, is you're really looking to persuade. And so often the briefs are so stuffy and the lawyers act as if they were in England in like 1790.
At the Old Bailey.
They don't really try to sell the judges, where you have the opportunity. The judges are just like a jury, and they're looking to be entertained. They're looking to be persuaded. And it's so close between victory and defeat, where when you think about it, like, I've had a lot of 2-1 decisions in my career. That was like my failure to get one other judge on my side. And so you're constantly looking to work on that and to persuade and to try to convince them that, like, this is an injustice and you're right, and the only way to remedy that injustice is to rule for you.
Well, so it's interesting that you bring up kind of those 2 different perspectives, but I'll say this. I 100% agree with you in terms of like your description of the mindset going into trial, because I think that a lot of times, and this has evolved as I've gotten older and gained more experience, but I mean, you should make the state have to do their job, right? Which is or the state or the government in your case in federal practice, right? So I think that, and we talked about this before, I mean, filing motions, like, unless it's completely baseless, like, go for it. What's the worst that's going to happen? Unless there's a situation in which, you do file a motion, it might be bad for your client, right? But I think all of those things that are unique to criminal defense, I think there's just a component of creativity that I think sometimes the government just doesn't have, because they've got their elements, right? They've got they've got to tick their boxes. And I've always thought of this from kind of the beginning of, okay, if my client is not guilty, or if not guilty is what we're trying to achieve here, how do I explain that, right? And it's weird that even though the burden of proof isn't on us, in a way you have to tell that story, right? And make it work with those facts. And so I do think that's interesting. I also find that quite honestly, negotiations get better when prosecutors know which attorneys are going to try cases. I mean, that just 100% is true. And that's such a valuable thing that I try to tell younger attorneys now that I'm in kind of like an intermediate phase of my career, because those are things that are going to help you, help your clients. And that all comes along with your reputation for, being scrappy and willing to put in the work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the best advice I got was this great lawyer, Jim Shello. He used to say that the difference between good lawyers and great lawyers is motion practice. And the great lawyers were the ones who were really willing to put in the motion practice, and they saw it as a means to an end. And they sat down and creatively thought about how they were going to win the legal points and develop the legal points to aid the factual development of their case. Because as you're right, like the more the prosecutors have to worry about losing, the more the judge is thinking about it, the better you have the opportunity to win and to persuade. And Shello told me the story. He was, a very great lawyer, but when he early in his career, he was with these lawyers from Chicago, and Jim was very much consumed with the facts and what the facts were going to show, and the FBI was hiding facts, et cetera. And the lawyer from Chicago was there with these law books, and Shello said, like, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm figuring out the jury instructions. That's what I care about. I don't care about what I do and don't know. I care about what the jury is going to have to decide. But from that, he would constantly pound, this is the weakness in the case. This is what they're going to have to prove that they're not going to be able to prove, whether it's in a conspiracy and there's a unity of purpose, or whether or not it's a boating accident, the person was driving recklessly. And what does recklessly mean on the water in a huge open body of water? But yeah, so I agree. I think you have to have that in your tool belt, because then it allows you to be more persuasive. You come to know the case more, and the prosecutor has already had to think like, wow, this person is really invested. They're already filing all these motions. They're probably going to go to trial. Like, they're not afraid. They're definitely not blinking. This is not an easy plea.
Right.
So the negotiations get better then.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too what you brought up about jury instructions, because sometimes you look at cases and I always start there because that's just what I was taught. And I think it's such a good place to start because, first of all, you have to know what they're supposed to be able to prove, right?
Right.
And unpacking everything from there just makes logical sense. So it's interesting though, when you think about how jury instructions are crafted and you know, the committee and all the information that goes behind it, right? And then what regular people from the community actually think that they mean, right? And there's a lot of interesting stuff that I've found along the way too, just in terms of how people read this. And you look at it and it's like, there's so many lawyers involved with legislation and all of these things, right? And sometimes I think we fail to like put our regular people hats on and look at this in a way that, you know, your cross section of the community that are going to be your jurors will look at that information. So I also think it's important to, you know, be able to kind of parse away, you know, the legal technical aspects and just be able to like communicate effectively. Cause I think you get so much out of that you may not expect until it's actually time to, you know, time to kind of go to bat. So I find that interesting as well.
No, I agree. I think the jury instructions are usually indecipherable, and you can go back and try to, at least in my view, I always try to go back to the seminal opinions that the court has talked about that jury instruction, and they'll usually have a colorful line. So I forget what in the conspiracy context, it's like a unity of purpose or something like that. And nobody knows what a unity of purpose is. Like I've never even heard any, like at a bar or a coffee shop, nobody has ever talked about a unity of purpose between myself and the coffee barista that I would have a latte. Instead, like there's a great line that says a meeting of the minds. And you're like, oh, like I kind of like my wife and I often fight about what was communicated about who's picking up who. And like, was there like, did we have an agreement? Did we understand each other? Like, okay, well, like that's a normal speak that she just assumed that I understood that I had to pick up all the kids when clearly that was not communicated. So I think that you have to go back to the original cases, understand it in a layman's terms. And some judges are very willing to actually engage in that and rewrite them in a way. And they're meant to be rewritten to the specific facts of the case and to what's going on, and taking away needless elements, or what we call trapdoor instructions, which are, you know, they have 15 different means of violating the statute. And only one of them is at issue. Like, why do you have to talk about harboring, enticing, coercing, when really it's just like whether or not you provided for somebody. Right. So I agree with you. I think you have to break it down into really digestible terms that Larry Bugni can understand.
So how did you make the transition from clerking to actually going to practice? And I say that because I didn't do the clerkship path. I think that that's a really unique path that people take out of school, which is obviously a very coveted position. But you're going from kind of seeing the inner workings, all the behind the scenes from the judicial perspective, to now representing clients directly. What was that transition like for you, and how did you get connected with the Federal Defender's Office?
So it was really hard. It was, I mean, looking back, I'm like, oh, that was a really bad period of my life. I got connected because I went to a dinner, and there was the head federal defender, this guy, Dan Stiller, and we were just talking about advocacy. And he told me, hey, we're going to have an opening. You should apply. And I didn't really think about it at the time, but it turned out to be a really great place to transition. as far as, and Dan was a great mentor, and he ran a great office. As far as what it was like, it was so hard. Like like those first few years of practice, I have so much mercy on new lawyers because it is brutal. It's brutal to be stripped of everything you thought was going to be easy. So starting out, I was super prideful. You, as a law clerk, you think you know everything and that it's going to be so easy. And once you're there, then the judges will finally see the error of their ways, and you're going to be able to always win. That clearly didn't happen. It was the roughest, probably 2 years of my life. But I was very blessed to have a great mentor in this guy, Craig Albee. And Craig was, he was very, very demanding, but he also gave me insights, and he just stripped me of my false sense of self. And like, what was a good advocacy? He was like, look, focus on the client, focus on the elements. Did you do the hard work? And he was so demanding, but he was so good. And so the greatest thing that aided my transition and probably kept me as a lawyer was having a mentor like Craig Albee.
Craig is also one of the smartest people that I think I know. I mean, he's just absolutely brilliant. So I think anybody that has met him would agree with your assessment. So, but that also speaks to just the caliber of lawyers that are in that office or have gone through that office. Because when I think of amazing lawyers and also really good people, like I think of most of the people that have come through that office. And, you know, some of them are judges today and they're doing all kinds of great things. And so I really think that speaks to the caliber of like just exceptional attorneys, which also leads me to another point, right? One of the things that I hear from people, and I don't know if you heard that as much on the federal side of things, but, you know, we'll have people call and they complain about having a public defender, right? And I always tell people, like, I know so many public defenders that are incredible attorneys. There's going to be people who are, you know, kind of across the board, right, in whether it's private or public practice. But, you know, sometimes you'll look up a case and you'll see who's assigned to the case and you're like, you are lucky that you got this person. This is an incredible attorney. So I will say that might be a little bit odd coming from the perspective of somebody who's been essentially entirely private practice, but I will never not speak well of public defender colleagues because, I mean, they're literally doing this all the time. And, you know, it sucks to have an insane caseload, although I think it's probably a little bit different from the federal perspective. I actually don't know if that's true. Maybe you can tell us, did you have an insane caseload as a federal public defender, or was that different compared to like state court levels?
It was definitely different. I think it's always hard to compare apples and oranges where you would have, I may not have 120 cases. I probably had about 25 to 35 cases at any time. But you would also get, you know, 1.8 terabytes of information. Sure. And, you know, a conspiracy that the search warrant affidavit is 180 pages long. So, you know, like what you lack in volume, you make up in work. And then you're always, you know, your adversary is always the FBI. So they have very good, smart, they're also like agents or lawyers, and they know how to drown you in material. And so, no, but I completely agree with you. I think many of the best lawyers in the state are public defenders. I think, in my view, Craig Albee is among the top 2 or 3 lawyers in the state. I only say he's not the top because, you know, there's most people would be like, well, what about me? But I think any conversation about who is the most effective, best lawyer, the person I'd want if my wife was arrested would be Craig Albee. I think he's just tremendous. And you have like people like Gabby Leha and Guy Carboni and so many others that just do a tremendous, tremendous job. You wouldn't do better. And whenever anybody calls to complain about them or to try to hire us, I always say, you know, like, no, you're going to do great. Craig's the one that taught me. Now, if they offer me, you know, an ungodly sum of money, that might, you know, change the tune. But no, I'm teasing about that. I think you're never going to go wrong with the federal defender's office. They're just tremendous lawyers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I want to talk to you about, because it's so different than what I do, is your appellate practice work. You have been recognized for some of your exceptional writing, and I've read some of your writing, and it's incredibly engaging. I think because of what you alluded to before, this idea that sometimes there's this stuffiness quality, and we need to break down and kind of, tell that story to the judge in a compelling way. I guess tell us a little bit, from your perspective of some of the work that you're most proud of to the extent that you can talk about it. And also, what advice would you give young lawyers looking to get into appellate practice?
That's a great question. So I think my style is really based off of a guy named Rudolf Flesch. He was a writer in the 30s. On your Word document, on any Word document, has a Flesch scale. And he has a book called The Art of Readable Writing, and he has a bunch of other books. And his big takeaway is, don't try to sound smart. Like, really smart people use very simple words and colorful. They use nouns and they use adjectives and they use verbs. You really want to make it so it's very plain. And it's plain in that, it captivates you. It's not, you don't need all these polysyllabic words that nobody knows and just so you sound smart. So the art of readable writing has always been how I've tried to write, as if it was a New Yorker article or it was something you read in Atlantic. As far as the briefs I'm most proud of, it's hard. I think, so I'm old now. And I think early on in my career, I was really in love with the turn of phrase. I thought I was so clever with whatever I would do with an M-dash. But now I've really gotten into graphics and to tables and to charts, because I realized that people learn differently. I have 2 kids who are neurodivergent. And when you realize that not everybody is in love with, a great paragraph, but they need to digest the information in a different way. Well, that challenges you to present it outside the way a normal lawyer or a normal brief was. So I try to do a lot with tables, comparing and contrasting with illustrations, showing with a Venn diagram or different aspects to boil down the point visually so that somebody can understand it. So as far as what I'm most proud of, I think it has been that evolution of myself as a brief writer. I think as far as the victories go, they're not the ones that I've actually been recognized for. I think those briefs, they're good, but they're what other lawyers really wanted to read. They were
Sure.
the judges at the state bar thought they were great. But the ones that I thought were great were the ones that my clients actually won. they were
that always makes something great. No, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it could be the worst brief, but if your client's going home, that's what matters most. Otherwise, it's just sort of an ego trip.
Yeah.
But it's an ego trip of you really put in hard work, but the very best briefs are those that brought somebody home.
So kind of piggybacking off that issue, a lot of the cases that you deal with are pretty significant high stakes cases. And with that being said, how do you build trust and rapport with a client just knowing that there's so much on the line? Because I think, every case is important to every client, no matter if it's a big case or a small case. But I think when we're looking at cases where there's serious exposure that, could put somebody in prison for the rest of their life or those types of things, I mean, that's a different dynamic that is always kind of in the background of whatever we're doing with the client. And so how do you build trust and rapport with the client? How does that kind of color your interactions in terms of how you, maybe kind of get connected with the client for the first time going forward?
Yeah, I do it a little bit different. I mean, everybody does it differently. I never try to establish that I'm the attorney and the smartest person in the room, nor do I try to pretend that I'm their savior. I really just sit there and listen to them, and I usually ask them how I can help them. And I sit there and I might be like, do you have a mom or a girlfriend or a brother that you want me to call and just update them? Mm-hmm. And what else can I do right here? I always listen. I think too often lawyers do all the talking. And early in my career, I did a lot of talking. But I just sit in the lockup and I just listen to them. And sometimes with, people who are out of custody, I had one recently It was like 3 hours, and she was crying. She's like, "You're the first person who's really seen me," because I acknowledged how hard it was, what she was going through. So I just try to be very empathetic and listen to them and see where they're at. I never try to tell them how it's going to go, or that I promise them I'm going to win the case, or this is no big deal, or try to disparage what they're feeling. So I think validating who they are most of all, but like also validating what they're feeling at this moment, that it's natural. Then what I usually try to do is take it outside the paradigm of the case. So I never really speak in the first few meetings about the case. I'm like, well, let me figure it out. Like, I need to see the search warrant affidavit. I need to see the evidence.
Right.
I need to figure out the elements of this. But I do know that I'm talking about, if I was talking to a client, I do know that what you and your wife are enduring right now is crushing. And I've been through this with so many people. You need to actually like sit down or go for a walk with her and let her be angry at you. And like, you need to be able to be secure enough in who you are to tell her that this is really hard and you can't hold it all in. So I usually try to talk to them as I would a neighbor or a person that, you know, is a good friend of mine, but that doesn't have a criminal case. And then from there, I try to check up with them all the time. I usually text a lot of my clients. Just, how are they doing? Check in. And then when it comes to like what I know about the case, I'm pretty well prepared. And I say, like, look, this is not an issue. This is not an issue. I know you heard that from your buddy in the jail cell, but like, that's not an issue. But here are the 3 things that I think we can do. And then I back it up. And I try to be in full communication with them. I always say, there are no bad ideas. And I don't want you to go through this experience saying, like, I wish Bugni would have filed that motion. And I always tell them this one story. It was one of my first clients. He and I were sitting talking about the case, and I thought I knew everything. I clearly didn't. And he's like, well, what about bullets? They're not illegal for people to have in Wisconsin, for felons to have in Wisconsin, but they are federally. And I was like, oh, is that true? And he's like, yeah, it's true. And I was like, okay. So I ended up doing the research, and he wanted me to file a motion on that. And I did, and I ended up winning the case. And so I always gave him credit. I wasn't like, oh, like, you know, like I came up with that idea. I said I knew that Mike did. And it was transformative. So I've never turned away a client's ideas. I've always sat down and digested them, explained to them why they would work or why they wouldn't work. But it's always been, I've probably won 3 or 4 cases based upon my clients' insights that I didn't otherwise see. And so like giving them that validation and letting them know it's a team effort, I think that makes them feel heard, but also seen. And then there's usually a great trust deposit that's going back and forth between the 2 of us.
One of the things that, you know, you kind of mentioned about that I think is interesting is the need to feel seen and heard. And I think we all have that, right? We all have that just in our lives as human beings. But more often than not, when I have clients that come to me that maybe already have an attorney and they're looking for someone else or something like that, I think that I don't want to say that it's across the board because it's not, but I think there's definitely some issues with clients not feeling like, you know, they're able to be heard, right? Or they're just kind of being pushed through, you know, kind of the system in a way that they're not happy. And it may not be from the perspective of the client saying, I know that I can win this whole thing, right? Like more often than not, like clients have like a very reasonable, I think, concept of what they are looking at in those circumstances, but they want to know that somebody actually fought for them. And that's where I think, you know, you lose some of that ability to connect if you're not just like entertaining and listening to honestly all of the concerns, all of the ideas and thoughts, right? Because I might look at this and I might look into it and I might say, okay, like, I understand why you want to go this route. Let me explain to you why that doesn't apply here, right? And more often than not, I feel like people are happier hearing that answer as opposed to like, no, we can't do that. Like, we can't do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, some of the worst moments in my career have been, I mean, I don't know what it's like in Waukesha. I know Milwaukee County. Well, I do know Waukesha. But in Dane County, you would sit down and you could hear the conversation going on next door.
Oh, wow.
And I remember guys were like, they hadn't had the discovery yet and they were already selling a plea deal. And the guys, I would hear the clients just imploring them to like take another look at the case. They didn't do it or whatever it was. And guys, like, well, like, this is bullshit. You know what I just did for you? And, people would be grateful. And I'm like, well, why would they be grateful?
Yeah.
If you got it done in 10 minutes or a 2-minute conversation with the prosecutor, probably it didn't take much. But I think that part of it, just being merciful and charitable, I think it's a hard job to be a criminal defense attorney. And so many people are like solo practitioners who didn't have the benefit of mentoring under Craig Albee and seeing his humanity and the way that he treated people. So I think it's probably the fact that they're not able to see the clients is just the pressures of this job. And so whenever I talk to people, when people want to hire me, they already have an attorney, I'm always like, well, why don't you just try to block out a time to say, like, what I would really like to talk to you, like, don't catch them with a spontaneous phone call at 2 p.m. and ask them like all these crazy questions.
Right.
Like, just be like, I just need to sit down with you and my mom. I've written out the questions. Like, let's go over them. And if you do that and you're still not satisfied, then please come to me. But for the most part, that usually is like the greatest way to do it, because I get calls at like, 7:30 in the morning and people are like, have you looked at the Johnson decision? I'm like, man, I haven't thought about your case in like 3 weeks. Like, I'm trying to get in to do this brief. My wife's yelling at me. Everything is really hard at home. But if you put it on the calendar, and I know that we're going to talk at 3:00 on Wednesday, I'm starting to look at it. You can feel seen. So I think there are small little tools that lawyers can use to do that.
I've really been using Calendly a lot, because I tell people, and I've given like a communication policy, and it's not like hard and fast. I mean, ideally, I would love for everyone to follow it to the T, but I say that because it's not because I'm trying to like push off what you have to say, but it's because I want to make sure that I have dedicated time to talk to you about this, so I can be prepared going into this, and you can share comments with me, and that if you book a call for this time, it's time that I'm available, right? So that we can make it work. And I've found that a lot of people have been pretty receptive to that, and they like it because it gives them the autonomy to kind of go in and see, what actual availability I have that works with theirs. And it's been really helpful also on the flip side, so that I can have a little bit more control of trying to, as much as we try to control our schedules, but can't really, get some deep work in or something like that. Cause you're right. I mean, it is one thing when you are, surrounded by a team. When you're a solo and you have one staff person, it's challenging. Like, I never imagined myself in that position again. And you and I have talked about what maybe that will entail in the future. But I think that just grace around the board to everyone is so helpful, because at the end of the day, whether it's an attorney-client relationship or any other professional relationship, with either co-counsel or opposing counsel or whatever, I mean, I think there's an element of grace that goes a long way, just in terms of, those kinds of interactions, because you never really know what anybody's going through, right? And I think for our profession, and this because you've talked a lot about, self-care and burnout and those things, I think lawyers are expected to be like on all the time, at the expense of like themselves. And I have always said, I can't take the best care of my clients if I'm not taking care of myself. Like, I just can't, And I think that idea is becoming more widely accepted, just in terms of acknowledging that, hey, like, we need to figure out productive ways to de-stress or unplug to the extent that we can, so that we continue to be, good at our jobs for the people that are putting their trust in us. So I know that's something that you've written about and spoken about. What are some things that you would share really for lawyers at any stage of their career about, self-care and making sure that they're in a good place?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if your listeners know, are alluding to, I wrote an article about the nervous breakdown that I suffered. Maybe it was 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago now. And so I'm very keenly aware of the pressures that come to lawyers. I think, to answer your question, it's really twofold. One, I tell every lawyer that the most important thing you can do is not work on your cross-examination skills or your brief writing skills, your closing, your opening, or your voir dire. Instead, it's learning how to work. Like, you're going to work more than you're going to cross-examine, infinitely more. So learn how to work. And there's lots of books about it. And so you should read those books and figure out the best methods. Like you mentioned, deep work. we're using Calendarly, like learning your rhythms. The more that you're learning how to work, the more that's going to allow you to be the lawyer and person that you want to be. So that you can have those hard deadlines of like, I'm going to stop working at 5. I'm going to stop working at 6. You also don't feel overwhelmed because every once in a while in my career, and even just recently, I told my wife that I felt like my tombstone could read, "I've disappointed everyone," because it feels like that all the time, where you're really trying to, and that was just a bad season where I took a big case that I probably shouldn't have, and it sucked all the air out of the room. But you need to learn how to work, and if you learn how to work, then you're going to feel more efficient, but also you're going to be, the work's more rewarding and you're not as constantly stressed out. As far as the balance goes, it's hard. I think oftentimes people say those words and they mean different things. I think there's self-care and then there's like self-pampering, where people set these arbitrary boundaries and they're like, I can't work past 4, or, well, it's a 3-day weekend, therefore it needs to be a 4-day weekend, or, they come in every morning at like 9:30 or 10, and you're like, what is going on? You still have to be a professional.
Right.
I think that self-care is, you have to have a good exercise routine. You have to sleep well. I think you also have to understand that, like, you're not indispensable. Like, the cemetery is full of people who thought they were indispensable. And you have to know that, like, your client needs you to be at the top of your game. And the only way you're at the top of your game is if you're actually the person you're meant to be, and you actually have balance and fulfillment, and you have those things. But that also is a big part of it, is your job should be rewarding to you. You're not paid just to build widgets. This is an incredibly privileged position to be in. Like, we get to represent people. We get to defend them against the state. We get to know them as human beings. And so when you incorporate that into your life, you actually find rewards and balance within the work itself.
Yeah, I think, at least this season of my life, I feel like is becoming more streamlined in terms of what all of that looks like. And I tell people when I'm talking to people that are either in law school or, newly out, like, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It just isn't. And that is because anything litigation related is going to have its ups and downs. I mean, it does, depending on where you're at in the case and what needs to be done. I mean, it's always going to be that way. But, there are things that you can do. And I think creating non-negotiables for yourself, because at the end of the day, it's like you can only run on empty for so long. And especially when you're in your 30s, you're in your 40s, and, you're getting older in your career, it's like your body's not going to be able to keep up with you at that pace. And then, do you want to wait until all the wheels fall off? And unfortunately, I think that was kind of a thing that was so common, or, people would be hiding, drinking problems or substance abuse problems. I mean, like, lawyers in particular as a profession have seriously high rates of substance abuse issues. And I think we sometimes forget that, like, just because we're doing this job, that doesn't mean we're immune to, like, all these other issues that people have, because at the end of the day, we're people and we have stress, and we need to, figure out a way to navigate that in a way that is healthy, right? But I also just think there's, like, a huge stigma in terms of, like, professionals or white collar jobs, and people, like, admitting that they're, like, so stressed that they need to take a break. You know what I mean? Like, that is something that I have seen become more common in terms of people just, recognizing that they need some time, or, they don't want to be burnt out, like, all of those things. So I'm hopeful in that regard that attitudes are changing about that, or at least that there's more solidarity between colleagues and things when people speak out about stuff. But, it's the challenges are never going to go away. It's always how we adapt to them.
No, I think you're right. I think it's really hard as a criminal defense attorney, because you can hide that you're not performing for a long time, because you kind of assume, you're like, most of our clients, I know this sounds scandalous, but are guilty. And, like, most of our clients, like,
yeah,
you could be like, well, the client wanted to plead, or, like, whatever it might be, and the motion is just like some canned motion that you had, or, like, well, you could, if you can persuade a jury of 12, you can persuade your client to take a plea deal. And if you do that consistently, you start to erode your professional reputation, but it's going to take a while. It takes a long time to figure out that dude is not well, because you're assuming the best. And so I see the alcoholism. I've had really good friends who they had to take a long break from the practice of law. And there were times where I was like, I should have stepped in and said something. I thought something, but I didn't really, like, you're always kind of assuming the best, and they're really good at hiding things. I just think having more open dialogues. I know one lawyer, I was just, when I was candid about my nervous breakdown, it introduced so many people emailing me and calling me and asking me for coffee, because they felt like nobody was talking about it. Mm-hmm. And that I think is a great shame, because when I had my breakdown, I went out with a lot of lawyers, and all of them talked about how they had struggled and what they did, and that meant a lot to me, because I didn't feel alone. But it shouldn't be that it takes a article in the Wisconsin Bar Journal for people to be like, oh, there's somebody else who actually, this job is really hard and it takes a toll on their mental health. Like, yeah, it does. And I think, but it also can't be so patronizing. I think that's the other thing is, so oftentimes people want to make it a quick, neat fix. Yeah. And being a criminal defense attorney is really hard. When you see the crime scene photos, when you see like the evidence, when you know the person next to you, or when you lose a trial, it eats at you and eats at you. So I think that people really have to embrace that this needs to be discussed, and it needs to be discussed more than just at a bar.
Well, I think there's, in terms of things, and I'll say this is anecdotal because this is just what I've seen in whatever, if it's online or wherever it is. But I think there's more of a conversation about vicarious trauma as it relates to prosecutors than it does defense attorneys, quite honestly. Yeah. No, totally. And I think there's this attitude that because we defend people that many times are guilty, or because that's the side that we choose to align ourselves with, that somehow there's kind of, I don't want to say like an endorsement, but there's a different moral, like, I guess, judgment over that job that you still see. And it's not so much, I would say, in the legal profession as much, because people understand. And I think you told me criminal defense attorney is the only job listed in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights. One of those two. Correct me if I'm wrong. But, so yes, there's absolutely like a critical importance to that job. But along with it, I always get people, giving feedback of like, how do you defend people that are guilty? I was like, well, that's not what it's about. Number one, I mean, that's just not what the job is about. I look at it as an opportunity to hold the government accountable and make sure that if they're going to do something that takes away somebody's, life or their freedom, that they've done it according to what the law says they can do. Right. I mean, that should be a really like across the board popular concept, you would think. But sometimes I think that's lost, because when you think about the types of crimes that people get involved in, they're really gruesome and horrific and terrible. And I think that over time, reading those complaints, looking at the discovery, looking at photos, looking at all this stuff, it weighs on you in a way that like we don't really talk about beyond our circle, because who else is going to understand that, right? And I think there's a level of like dark humor that is a coping mechanism, but again, like it would never be appropriate in any other forum. And so it's like, I think we have to like also acknowledge that there's a lot of heavy shit that you're dealing with day in and day out. And we can't, pretend that doesn't have an effect on us, to take a step back. And like you said, I mean, losing at trial sucks, like in a way that I can't describe many other things, because it's not lost on me that I get to get up and leave the table and I get to go home, and at the end of the day, the person next to me might not have that opportunity.
Totally. And you're the one who screwed it up because you didn't have the best closing, or you didn't object, or whatever it might be. I think two things of what you said that I think are interesting to the listeners, I hope, is one, I represented a cop a few years ago, and he had gone through a lot of trauma, and I was able to get all the reports, and I had no idea. And then I did all the research because he was like, I really wanted to really know him and know what he was going through. And it turns out like the number one cause of death for police officers is suicide. And they're like far more likely, more than that. It's like all the other causes of death, put together don't equal what the amount of suicides that they have because of what they see and those crime scenes. And we see the same. And I remember kind of pushing it to the side because I was an idiot. And then we had a social worker who gave a presentation on secondary trauma. We just kind of humored her and we were like, fine, you can give us a presentation. And after it, every one of us was like, oh, I have that.
Oh.
I have that. I deal with that. And you see that. And so I'm glad there's more of a discussion. I just think it really needs to be part of it. And it's not just the gallows humor. Like, there needs to be a point where you can really cry and you can see it and you can know that, like, I feel terrible what happened to that kid. I feel terrible what's happened to my client. I feel terrible. And just be open.
I think for me, one of the weirdest like realizations is occasionally like, you know, you go through all this material that, you know, depending on the case and on what the case is, I mean, it's horrible stuff. And you get to the point where there's something where you have like a very visceral reaction. You're like, oh, good. Like, I'm still a human. Like I have a reaction to this that's probably the appropriate reaction, which is also kind of a weird, jarring phenomenon as well, because you get so accustomed to reading all these things and looking at this through your lawyer lens that, you know, you kind of take a step back from like what the average person who does not work in this area, you know, would think about things. So it's challenging. I don't know what all the answers are, but I think it's good that people are having conversations about it because, you know, what I found is that bottling it up and stuffing it away is never the best answer for anything. And it's interesting that you brought that up about police officers, because I was listening to a podcast the other day that was actually just yesterday that was talking about that and the amount of PTSD that police officers have, which, you know, you think of that and you think of that in terms of like the military context, because I think that's how the general public, you know, at least was introduced to like concepts of PTSD. You think about service members who have been in combat deployments, but then you also take a look at like what police officers respond to on a regular basis. And that is in some ways probably more repetitive and more persistent over the course of a career than some of those experiences. So it's just, it's I think important to have that in the back of one's mind as well. As much as I take issue with a lot of things that the police do, you know, there's also a humanity component there.
Yeah, you can never lose sight of that. My heart breaks for for the things that they have to see, and because you see them as people. Like, most cops are actually pretty decent, and you get to know them, and you know, you're sitting there, and you know, some I've cross-examined multiple times. You know, they refer cases to you, and you get to know them as people, and you're like, I'm really sorry that you had to see that. Yeah. And I'm sorry that you had to, like, you know, this was such a big part of who you are. Steve Hurley often talks about this one movie where this Russian policeman like goes and does this investigation. He's on there for like 10 years. He finally catches the guy. And then he finds out that the FBI rotates people off of these types of cases every 3 years because they found out it's too traumatizing. And he breaks down just like crying, because he had held it in under the stoicism of like, I can deal with this. And we just can't allow that. We can't allow that for anybody, whether it's prosecutors, judges, you know, policemen, defense attorneys. Like, this is real horrific stuff. And people have to be able to process it, but also know that it's okay that you're uncomfortable with it, because it is uncomfortable. It is horrifying.
So on a positive note, I just want to ask you this, because I think this is important to ask too, right? We've talked a lot about, you know, the stress and all of the like gritty aspects of this job, but I want to know what, from your perspective, is the most rewarding or positive aspect about your job as a criminal defense attorney. You kind of talked about what a privilege it is to be in this role, but I'm just curious if you can think of anything.
I mean, I think the relationships with my clients, I think that, you know, you definitely have like a few highlights where, like, I've had clients who, one guy, I represent him in a drug case, and it turned out he was a savant, and he had all these great math skills. And I still remember he said, I was like, you know, he's like, oh, I know the source of the drugs is like Tron, and he's a medium build, medium height African-American guy in his 20s or 30s. I was like, oh, in Chicago. I was like, oh, we can get an APB out on that guy real quick. I was like, you got to give me something else. And he was like, well, I do know his license plate number. And I was like, what? how do you know his license plate number? I thought maybe he had a vanity plate. And he just named it off. He's like, well, it's two of my favorite numbers. And I was like, you have a favorite number? I guess, I don't know. I didn't know you were 7. But turns out he did. And I started to question more, and it turned out he was a genius.
That's awesome.
And so I was able to, but he graduated last in his class, barely graduated. He was a career offender, and he was facing a mandatory minimum life if we were to go on a trial. But got him out on bond, sat down with his grandma, and we got him into DeVry or MAT, one of the technical schools, and he got a computer degree, and then went to UWM and got a computer science degree.
Wow.
Ended up getting probation. The judge came down off the bench to shake his hand. We dragged the case out a long time so we could do this stuff.
Sure.
But it's the relationships that I've been able to cultivate, and it's not just with that one client, with Ronnie. It's really with, I actually had a client live with me for a couple months who was an immigrant from Afghanistan.
Oh, wow.
And I've had, I've held my clients' hands when they're in the hospital and they're dying. Their families had called me I actually went just 2 weeks ago. A former client had a stroke, and the family asked me to come over and say goodbye to him because he meant so much to me and I meant so much to him. And there have been, I've been at my clients' baptisms. I've been at their birthday parties. I stood up in their weddings. So it's the relationships with them, because I never really see it as a quid pro quo of, I'm going to get you off of this case and then it's over. But really, it's been in a relationship with somebody, because I feel that you fight more for what you love that's behind you or next to you in the criminal case than you do what's ahead of you. The people are like, I hate the state and I want to, I hate the carceral state. I'm like, well, your hatred for prison is going to burn out, but my love for my client will never, it never dissipates. And so I continue to fight and fight and fight. And then that love, I try for the most part to never sever the relationship with a client. Like if they call 5 years later or 5 months later, oftentimes it's for free legal advice. But they'll also call just to say hi, or they were thinking of me. And a few of them will text me every year at the anniversary of the win, which is really nice. Like, oh yeah, I forgot about that.
It's so funny that you say that, because I think of some of the little gestures that have kind of happened along the way. And I think there's an element of this job that is so thankless in some ways, that like the fact that like somebody appreciates what you did for them, and just kind of that relationship. I mean, not even what you did for them, but the fact that you were willing to work with them, right? Like I had a client's mom like text me to bring me like honey from her bees, because I made some off the cuff comment about how I've been looking for like local honey, and it just like, it made my day. It's so funny how like little interactions and just, I guess, those relationship aspects of just kindness and I don't know. It's just something that I think you don't always see depending on how you approach the situations. Like you don't always see in this particular career, but it's always just kind of the icing on the cake, to getting a result for somebody that, they're happy with.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the fruits of the relationship, because people really care about, when they know that you care, they're going to stick with you through thick or thin. And I had one who just called me up the other day to complain about the deal. And after, I was like, do you just want to vent? Is that what we're doing right now? Because if it is, like, I'm totally here to hear you. Like, it's totally unjust. And the fiance was yelling at me that I was selling her out and everything. And then after they were done, I explained again the thought process for what we were doing. And he was like, oh, I didn't know all that.
Yeah.
But it was a relationship. And I asked them, if I could get a T-shirt from their kid's school that they're so involved in, just to, like just a gesture, a small gesture. And I do think that the relationship is the key for being a successful criminal defense attorney. And those are what you're going to carry on throughout your life and what matter most.
It's interesting too, because I remember, so Julius Kim, my first boss, when I was kind of talking to him early on about struggling of how to deal with difficult clients, which I think mean different things to different people. But he told me something that I thought was really interesting, and it kind of ties back into everything about, what we've talked about today is sometimes you just have to kind of close the file and talk about like what's going on, because it's not about the case. Yeah. It's not about the case. It's about all of the other things that are going on. And yes, the case is a huge part of it, but like you kind of have to like get to the person, right? And sometimes that's what someone wants, is they just want to like vent and be heard, and maybe it has nothing to do with this weird particular issue on this case at all. It just is a bigger picture thing. And so I try to think about that as well, because I've found that can alleviate a lot of what I think people may perceive as like tension or not really seeing eye to eye, because it's like my job is to tell you what I think. My job is to give you options, but I can't decide what you want to do. You have to decide that, So I want to make sure that, whatever my clients decide, that they are good with that decision. Because like I said, I get to leave the table and I get to go home. I want to make sure that whatever they decide to do is something that they're behind 100%. And I will support that, whatever it is. So.
No, I think that's good advice from Julia, is that you do have to close the file sometimes. And I think that actually how they're going to accept the representation and the outcome is often determined by like where they seen.
Yeah.
I've had cases where the judge rattles off and then gives them like, probation or a year, versus like guys who got rocked. But the judge listened to the allocution and talked to them as a person, and they were like, no, I did that. I accept that. And you're like, wow, the humanity that is present within our profession is so often overlooked, but it is the most essential aspect of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to kind of touch back on a couple of things that we've talked about, just in terms of, you mentioned a couple books. I am like furiously taking some notes because I'm going to read some of them myself. But I guess I would say, what is an overarching piece of advice that you would give to a young lawyer that wants to do criminal defense work specifically?
Yeah, I think my advice, whenever anybody asks me out for coffee or that question, it's always twofold. Like, one, get a mentor. I think that so often, you get a good mentor. Like don't be afraid to like keep on looking. I was so blessed in having Jim Shello and Craig Albee. And Craig Albee in particular was just the greatest gift to me that I could ever. I thank him after every win. Like everything I do that I win, I'm always like, Craig, thank you so much. Sometimes he writes back, that's not really a win. but he you
got to keep it real, right? And keep you grounded.
Or that was too easy. Like, what do you like? Anybody could have done that. But so I think find a good mentor and be sincere in what you need and what you're asking for, and don't be unreasonable. Like, I didn't ask Craig to come and help me move and be my therapist. Like, I just needed good advice all the time. And to learn from him. But honestly, like, many people probably can't always find a good mentor, but you can always, there's always access to Amazon, and you can get good books. And there's a great line from Socrates, which, maybe he said, maybe he didn't, but Plato definitely says he said, is like, spend your time wisely reading the works of others, for what they've labored with hard work, you can get easily. The knowledge that they labored hard to gain, you can get easily through their works. And Jim Shello, Craig Albee, Dean Strang, Steve Glenn, all of those guys, Rob Hennick, always were reading books about advocacy. And there's so many treasures of advocacy out there, whether it's Black's Law by Roy Black, or The Art of Advocacy by Paul Stryker, or F. Lee Bailey for the Defense. There's so many. And you can go and learn how to be a lawyer based upon what other people have done. And these are usually people at the top of their professions. I think Abby Smith at Georgetown has a brilliant book about the case of a lifetime. And if you're trying to improve as a lawyer, which is what you should always be doing, they call it the practice of law because you're constantly practicing. That means you're actually thinking about how to improve at all times. And the more that you read Mike Tiger on opening, or somebody on evidence, or McCarthy on cross-examination, or even a book about graphic design to learn how to communicate better, or even I've read books on emails. You know, like how is my email style? Like it's really poor, right, according to that book. You want to go and read deeply, because they're going to give you the feedback that you need that a mentor might not be able to. And it's going to help you improve your game in each way. So I always tell young lawyers to read, and to read deeply. And the algorithm is going to give you a lot of other suggestions. There's a lawyer out of Chicago, Vadim Glasman, and he's a tremendous lawyer, like probably among the very best, like with David Oscar Marcus. And he reads deeply. Like that dude is a deep reader, and he's somebody you should have on your show. He does a lot of podcasts. He really knows what books to read, and he's sucked the marrow out of those books. And you can see it in his profession. Like he's at the top of his game. He's flying all over the country doing these big cases because it's the product of what he's read and putting it into practice.
Well, I think that's a pointer for me to take home, because I spend a lot of time in the car, and I hope that I can find some of these on Audible, because I love to listen to Audible when I'm in the car. I prefer like an actual real book, because you can write in it and do things with it. But as much as you can make the time to absorb that information, I'm always down for that. So I've got a couple new things to put on my list. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure. And I hope that like I said, that you are absolutely one of those people to a younger generation of lawyers that you have mentioned. So keep doing what you're doing. And I very much value our friendship. And I thank you for taking time to chat with me today.
Well, thank you, Lexi. It's been a privilege. This is my first podcast. I hope I did okay.
Really?
And, yeah, it really is.
I'm shocked by that. Well, I appreciate it, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And I will tag you when it comes out.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.